Here it is time for us to study the book of Revelation this morning. We're in chapter 2. So, years
Oh,
ago,
that's pretty clever.
I changed purses.
Oh, I know. It's always disastrous to do that.
I think I'll take my mask off now. So, years ago, many years ago, when I was preaching every Sunday, and when you're preaching every Sunday, you can tell this kind of from what Dan does, that you're kind of looking ahead and thinking, so what am I going to preach? And so I did a series on Jesus' letters to the churches, but I took 7 sermons to do these 7 letters. I don't think I want to move quite that slowly this time. But last time I thought we would get further than we did. We just covered the Ephesus letter. Of course, it's kind of the pivotal beginning letter of these 7. We know much more about Ephesus and its past than we do any of the other churches in the 7. And it's that characteristic letter that we all stop and relate to, that a church that by the time John writes this, sends this letter from Jesus to them, this is like 30 some years, 35 years after Paul was there, probably 30 years or so after he wrote the letter to the Ephesians. But most students believe that the letter that we call Ephesians was really more a general letter, probably to these same 7 churches, and then some. So anyway, so I remember back then that I had lots of material, and I have lots of material to study now, but most of it is like history of and various information about that particular city. So what I'm going to do today is we're going to read the rest of chapter 2, and the other 3 letters in chapter 2, and we're going to do more of a comparing them, because there definitely is overlap and contrast between the letters. So now these are.
Honey.
Oh, this is not on.
Oh, okay.
Huh. I don't know. It says it's on.
I don't want to get on camera, thank you. Say something.
Oh, something.
More.
Something more? Okay. Now, it sounds like I'm hearing it.
Can you hear
Is that
now?
better?
I think the keys.
Oh, you don't
Oh,
have
I
the
do.
microphone, right? Thank you. I
Don't have
didn't
the
see that.
microphone up where it's picking me up.
There you are.
Okay, there we go. So,
Better?
we'll
No, not better.
do a
Okay.
little background on these cities and the church that's there. Interestingly, when you talk about Jesus writing to a church, and of course we want to think of this in our day, that we have different churches in one community. But in that day, each community had its church, though the churches may have met in separate, smaller groups. They were considered one church, the church within that city. So it's a little hard to imagine Jesus writing to the church in Santa Cruz, because we think, wait a minute, there's a lot of different churches with different emphasis, and this is one of the challenges about this is that we see these either commendations or critical issues that Jesus raises, but the church is not one thing. I mean, if you think carefully about the way the letters go, you see that at times he's recognizing There are some in the church that are going this way, and there's some that are going this way. But there may be a general thing about that church that he talks about, and yet there's always the individuals. The church is made up of individuals, and certainly from what we're aware of, churches that we have experience with, there are people with different ideas and different gifts and different emphasis within a church. So anyway, we begin in verse 8, to the angel or the messenger of the church in Smyrna write, "These are the words of him who is the first and last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death." To the angel of the church in Pergamum write, "These are the words of him who has the sharp double-edged sword. I know where you live." That's an interesting expression, I know where you live. "Where Satan has his throne. Yet you remain true to my name. You did not renounce your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was put to death in your city where Satan lives. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. You have people there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and by committing sexual immorality. Likewise, you also have those who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Repent, therefore, otherwise I will soon come to you and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna. I will also give him a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to him who receives it. To the church at Thyatira, to the angel of the church at Thyatira write, These are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like blazing fire, and whose feet are like burnished bronze. I know your deeds, your love and faith, your service and perseverance, and that you are now doing more than you did at first. Nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess. By her teaching, she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and eating of food sacrificed to idols. I have given her time to repent of her immorality, but she is unwilling. So I will cast her on a bed of suffering, and I will make those who commit adultery with her suffer intensely, unless they repent of her ways. I will strike her children dead. Then all the churches will know that I am he who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each of you according to your deeds. Now I say to the rest of you in Thyatira, to you who do not hold to her teaching and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets, I will not impose any other burden on you. Only hold on to what you have until I come. To him who overcomes and does my will to the end, I will give authority over the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. He will dash them to pieces like pottery. Just as I have received authority from my Father, I also give him the morning star. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. There's an interesting contrast between Ephesus. Now, I presume that Ephesus was a pagan city then as it was when Paul founded, and as a pagan city, it always had some of the elements of persecution or disapproval of Christianity. But the churches at Smyrna and Pergamum are particularly mentioned for the fact that they are churches that persecute the Christians. Now, why would that be? Well, Ephesus was a big cosmopolitan city, a lot of people coming and going there, kind of like New York or Chicago. It was a city of commerce, a city of business. And in a place like that, the Christians probably weren't so much noticed and set aside. But in Smyrna and Pergamum, these are both very Roman cities. And as such, the emperor worship and the idea that Christians had been officially outlawed by Rome stood out. And so their citizens were more intent on persecuting Christians. They also were both very pagan cities. Now, Ephesus had the great temple of Diana, as the King James translated it, or Artemis, who was the goddess supposedly of love, but actually their concept of love was not ours, and had prostitutes who served the temple and served the people. So it was definitely an immoral place, but not as much as Smyrna and Pergamum, where both of these cities had committed themselves to be Roman in their culture. So they sort of competed with each other as to who could have the most pagan temples and could be the most loyal to, especially to the worship of Rome itself, to the Roman Empire, and to the Caesar. So Smyrna is very interesting because Smyrna was a beautiful city. Among the materials that I was reading was quote after quote of ancient people saying, this is the most beautiful city in the world. It's a city Liz would like because they talked about that it always had cool breezes, that it never was too hot there or too cold. It was a lovely city, actually a city that was old and yet had been destroyed. Now, you have to understand that when you talk about Asia Minor, this was a troubled area for several reasons. We talk about Galatia. Now, Galatia is Galatia because it's the home of the Gauls. But the Gauls are those people in France, what now is France, that Julius Caesar conquered and said all Gaul is divided into 3 parts, etc. They were very warlike, barbaric people at that time. And they had overflowed their European area and come down into what now is Turkey, down into Asia Minor, and attempted to conquer the whole place. They didn't succeed, but they were a very warlike people. Then there were people that in the Old Testament you read about that you sort of think are among those other Ims and Ites that are mentioned, and yet they were another group that came down from Europe proper and attempted to conquer the whole area. So Smyrna was a city that was like 1,000 years old, except that for 400 of those years it was a ruin. It was just, there were a few people living there in the ruins, but it had been attacked by these marauding tribes that were coming in and destroyed. So when Jesus says, I am the one who died and came to life again, there are those who say, he's saying, this is kind of the character of your city. It was once dead. And then during the time of Alexander the Great, where this whole area was controlled by Alexander's forces out of what we would consider Greece, but actually Greece was part of their city, but not all of it, part of their country, but not all of it. So at that time, I'm told from my reading that Alexander the Great saw this once beautiful, wonderful city destroyed, and so he asked one of his generals if he would sort of take this city on and rebuild it, which he did, and he rebuilt it beautifully. It actually at one point had sort of a hill with temples. Most of the cities were built around some kind of a hill on which were temples. And around that hill was a street that actually was paved with gold. Now that's interesting, since later we have this emphasis that the New Jerusalem is a city whose streets are paved with gold. So Smyrna, when it was rebuilt, was built as a kind of a controlled city, kind of with wide streets and luxurious houses. So it was kind of a competitor to Ephesus, although Ephesus was much bigger and much more commercially situated but Smyrna had its own commercial area. So, but it was definitely an area that it was one of the first cities in that area to build a temple to Rome. They considered Rome to be a kind of the spirit of Rome, to be kind of a goddess. So they built a temple to Rome. And later then, of course, this took on the idea that if you're going to worship Rome, the emperor is the head of it, so you worship the emperor. So they developed this thing of saying, if you wouldn't say Caesar is Lord and do a little of a mini kind of worship of Caesar by putting a pinch anyway, they had this ceremony that you went through, and if you did that, you were fine. If you wouldn't do it, now the Jews were not required to do it, and there are Jews in each of these cities. We have this reference to the synagogue of Satan. Now, I don't think that Jesus is saying every synagogue now is a synagogue of Satan and not of God, but he's saying there are places where the Jews have established their own culture, and they still are talking about being Jews in the Old Testament sense, but they would be ones who had really long quit following the laws of God and quit worshiping the true God, and just used their power within the city to be what they wanted to be, and what they wanted to do was destroy the Christians. Many of the Christians were Jewish, but that just angered them all the more. So you have this situation where Rome was the ultimate persecutor, but somebody had to start that. If the governor didn't do it, then it became something that the citizens did. So when Jesus talks about the synagogue of Satan, he's saying, you have a synagogue, but it's not really our synagogue. It's not really God's synagogue. It's Satan's synagogue, because it's dedicated to destroying Christians and establishing this Jewish power base within the city. So now, in Pergamum is the ancient capital before the Roman Empire spread into this area. Even before Alexander the Great came to power, these were separate little kingdoms. And Pergamum was the capital of the kingdom. It's at the farthest north of this circle of churches. And at the time that it becomes the capital, it's a city that anybody would say, oh, this is very defensible. It had this mountain peak in the middle of it that they put their temples on. And of course, they could fortify and defend. So unlike Smyrna that was destroyed, Pergamum had this ability to defend itself. So, but as the ancient capital then, I think I mentioned once before, or maybe I mentioned it to my Wednesday night people, that this whole kingdom was given to Rome. Rome was on the rise. Alexander the Great had been killed, and so they could see that Rome was the coming power. So when they had an older king who, when he died, willed the country to Rome, just gave the whole country to Rome. So Pergamum continued to be its capital, even though Ephesus was its main city and Smyrna was more the ideal city, the city that they all looked up to. So he mentions Antipas, my faithful witness, who was put to death in your city where Satan lives. He talks about the synagogue of Satan in Smyrna, but he talks about Satan living. I think it's important for us to see that, there are those today who says, well, this ancient idea of a devil, we could believe in God to an extent, but we can't believe in a devil. Well, obviously, Jesus, in writing this, talks about the devil. He says the devil does things. It may appear to you that your neighbors, that your enemies are doing it, but really it's the devil who's doing it. So Satan lives in Pergamum because in giving it to Rome, they gave it to Roman religion. And Roman religion, he's saying, is really Satan's religion. So now, we don't know anything about Antipas. There are those who, commenting on this, say, well, Antipas was a great Christian leader who was put to death in Pergamum, but we don't have any record to rely on at the time telling about this. However, in Smyrna, we do have a record because there was a man, Polycarp, who was close to the Apostle John, a disciple, a follower, one who was taught by the Apostle John and was a helper of his work. And he ended up in Smyrna in his old age. He was as old as I am, I think, and was kind of considered the bishop, the leader of the church in Smyrna. Now this was in 155. So you can see if the book of Revelation was written in 96, this is like almost 60 years later. And they were having games like the Olympics, and the town was full of people who were, I should be celebrating today because my teams, the Giants, won 2 games over the Dodgers. That should make any Giants fan elated, but I don't really get all that elated about it because I don't want to get that down when they lose. But anyway, they were having these games, and now the city was full of people who'd come to the games, and somebody started shouting, let's kill, they called the Christians, they said that they didn't believe in the gods, so they were atheists. Let's kill the atheists. And somebody said, we should find Polycarp. He's the guy. So they found one of his servants and tortured him until he told them where Polycarp was staying. Then they took Polycarp and took him to the center of the city and burned him at the stake. Now it's interesting that from the stories, we have a lot of recording of this. The stories, Polycarp had a dream in which his pillow was burning, and he told his people, this means that I am going to die by fire. And so then the captain of the guard that was taking Polycarp, had gone and gotten Polycarp, said, would it really hurt you to say Caesar is Lord and put the pinch of stuff on the fire and do the little ceremony? And Polycarp is quoted as saying, for 86 years, Jesus has taken care of me, and he's never failed me. Why should I fail him? And he could not say, Caesar was Lord because Jesus was Lord. So then they were going to nail him to the stake. And he said, "You don't have to nail me. I'm not going anyplace. Bring on your fire." So they lit the fire, and there's all kinds of stories that the fire didn't really burn him, and they finally killed him with a sword. But anyway, Polycarp is the most well-known person to be executed in that whole time. And I remember from college days reading about Polycarp as the challenge to live that kind of dedicated life. So that was only 60 years after this letter or so. So nothing had changed. And you say, well, if Jesus is writing a letter to these poor persecuted people in Smyrna, shouldn't he write saying to them, "And I'm going to fix this. You're not going to have any persecution anymore"? That's what he says, does not say. He says, "Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. How are we supposed to understand this 10 days? Really? It starts on Sunday and it goes till the middle of the next week. No, I think so much of what is in the book of Revelation are symbolic in a way. So Jesus is not saying that persecution is going to be over in 10 days. He's saying it's going to not go on and on. 10 is one of those earthly numbers. You will have earthly numbers all through the book of Revelation. And I think in this case, the 10 days means that it's not going to go on forever. You need to be strong because it's going to be intense persecution, but it's not going to go on forever. But he always then points to individuals. And he says, "Be faithful even to the point of death. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." That's an interesting phrase, the crown of life. Several times in the New Testament, crowns are mentioned, including the crown of life. Now, this is not a king's crown. This is not a diadem. There's a place where Jesus is given the diadems, the king's crown. This is a Stephanus crown, which was the wreath thing that they gave to athletes who won the games, or they all wore at parties, or they wore when they went to worship their favorite god. So he says, "I will give you a crown of life." Paul says, there's competing in the games, and they compete for this crown of leaves that in a day or two is shot and thrown away. But we compete for a crown of life that never dies, that always will be there. And so Jesus is saying, so you are persecuted, and so you're put to death. But after you're put to death for me, I will give you life that will never go away. You will have the crown of life, or you will have life as your crown, as your reward. And then he says, to him who overcomes, he will not be hurt by the second death. This is the first place in the New Testament that the phrase second death occurs, and it really is a book of Revelation term. But what does it mean? Well, it means you can only in this world die once. Once they've killed you, there's nothing more they can do to you. They can desecrate the body, but you don't feel that. You don't care about that. But after you have been resurrected, this all goes back to Daniel's prophecy and then to prophecy through the New Testament, that it's not only the righteous who are resurrected, but it is the unrighteous who are resurrected. And they are resurrected to suffer what's called the second death. They being cast into the lake of fire, into hell, as it were, is the second death. So he says, so you may have the first death that you suffer, but that's over. It's not a long-term thing, but you will not be hurt by the second death. He's kind of saying, keep this being faithful unto death and dying in persecution in perspective, and the perspective you get is from the rest of the book. I think it's important to see that these letters are strongly attached to the rest of the book, because often the things that are talked about in the letters are further revealed in the rest of the book. So we're taken by the idea, I know your infliction and your poverty. I'm told that in Greek there are different levels of this, that you can be poor but sustaining, or you can have poverty, and poverty means you have nothing. And say, well, why did they have poverty? Well, it's attached to affliction. I know your affliction and your poverty. We sort of saw this, we who are old enough to remember that when the German Nazis turned on the Jews, part of what they did was said, you can take their possessions. And that's kind of what they did in the persecution of Christians. If you find a Christian, you can have them jailed or killed, and you can take their possessions. So we would assume that the reason that they're in extreme poverty is that the persecution has taken away their whatever money or anything of value they had, and it certainly would take away their jobs or their opportunity to make money, because once they were labeled as an outcast, they would not be treated. So he says, I know your affliction and your poverty, yet you are rich. Now next week we'll deal with a church that says to Jesus, well, he says, I know you say you're rich, but you're not rich, you're poor. And you need to see how poor you are. Here he says, you feel like you're poor, like you're in poverty, but you're rich. What you have in faith, what you have in store for you, you are rich. And focus on those riches, not on your poverty. The slander of those who say they are Jews. So the Jewish people were not so much saying, well, you don't worship Caesar. They were saying you do worship Jesus. And Jesus is not God, they would say. They would say you are unfaithful to God. So they had different slanders. They said that the Christians were cannibals because they took the bread and the blood at their sacrament, and they sort of made it that this was real flesh and blood that they were taking. They said that they were immoral because they had these love feasts. They said that they were people who weren't really sincere in their faith. They were just trying to be something that they weren't. So they had all this slander to heap on the Christians by the Jews who are not Jews, but the synagogue of Satan. Now, what does he mean when he says in Pergamum, I know where you live, where Satan has his throne? Well, this was some of these interesting ideas that in Pergamum, they had this kind of cone-shaped mountain in the middle of the city on which were the temples, and they had built a temple to Zeus being the chief of the gods in their mind, and it was built so that when you were approaching the city, even now, as a destroyed city, it looked like up on this hill there was this giant chair. They had built this temple in such a way that it looked like the arms and back of a chair. I don't get too excited about that kind of thing, but I do see that Pergamum was the capital city, and as the capital city, it also was the place where emperor worship was supreme. So I think that what Jesus is saying is Satan has his throne there because it's the worship of Rome and the emperor that is predominant. And yet, in Pergamum, as in Smyrna, he says, but in spite of this persecution, you're still there. You haven't fled, you haven't run away someplace because it's not wholesome to live there. You're staying there. You're being a witness for me there. So yet you have remained true to my name. There's kind of a contrast with Ephesus that seemed to have everything right except the love. And now he's saying, in a way, you have everything wrong that's going on there, and yet you remain true to my name. You did not renounce your faith in me, even in days of extreme persecution, when Antipas, who we have to assume was like Polycarp, was a leader of the Christians, and was put to death. Then you notice in Smyrna, it's often mentioned, there is no, I have these few things against you. Smyrna is all about you're a persecuted people, you're a suffering people, but you're my people and I'm standing by you. But even in Pergamum, though he says, I see that you're staying true in spite of persecution, nevertheless I have a few things against you. You have people there who hold to the teaching of Balaam. Now, what is the teaching of Balaam? He uses these Old Testament references, and there are those who say, well, this is a purely human book, and some clever person took these Old Testament references and worked them into this book. But we say, no. God, who is the author of the Old Testament as well as the New, God who watched these things happen, uses them as illustrations. So what about Balaam? Well, Balaam, we're first introduced to him that he is a prophet of the true God. And I know when I first read this story, I said, wait a minute, he's not a part of Abraham's descendants. How did he get to be a prophet of the true God? Well, the true God was the God of all humanity at one time, and there were those who still, like Abraham, who still held to the true God. However, Balaam's problem was that he wanted a religion that was profitable to him. So when the king of the land west of the Jordan comes to him and says, these people are coming to invade us, and I want you to curse them. Now, the idea that a prophet could curse somebody doesn't really go with Isaiah and Daniel and Ezekiel. They were never told to curse anybody. But Balaam was told that I will pay you a great deal of money if you curse these people. So you remember the story. He tried to curse them. They took him up on a hill so he could see them in the valley down below, and he tried to open his mouth to pronounce some kind of a curse, but everything that came out of his mouth was a blessing to them. And the king said, hey, of course, first we remember that as he was going to do this cursing, his donkey wouldn't go, and he's beating the donkey, and the donkey says, why are you beating me? And an angel is there with the sword in the path. The donkey sees it, but Balaam doesn't see the angel. So anyway, then if you pick up the pieces of this in other places in the text, that after he failed so miserably, he says, well, I can still curse these people if you will just do what I tell you. He says, if you will cause them to disobey their God will destroy them. So he said, send the prostitutes in among them. These are weak men. They'll cave into this, and they'll do things that are oppose the God. And then it always mentions food sacrificed to idols, but I think we remember Paul's discussion of this in Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians, and he says, idols are not real. Idols are made up beings, so they can't really affect you. But he says, the idea of eating meat sacrificed to idols, if it says to people, I am a believer in the idols, I am worshiping the idol, And at one point he says the idols really are demons. So if you're worshiping demons, you're in trouble with God. So I think here we still the teaching of Balaam, that we had people in the churches that Jesus is writing to who were saying, you don't have to be persecuted if you would just be more a part of the culture. If you would just bend a little bit here and compromise. One of my books says that Pergamum was the church of compromise. Well, it's not the only church of compromise in these 7 we will see. But anyway, if you, that we had these within the church, and it seems that these same people, maybe they're different approaches, but they kind of come out the same. The Nicolaitans that we saw in Ephesus, we see again in Pergamum, and we still don't know exactly who they are, but they all fit into this category that Jesus is talking about, of those who are teaching the people to do things that God would disapprove of, and by that means they are, Satan is using them to try to destroy the church. So he says there are people among you who are influential, who are insiders, who are teaching, and they're teaching you things that, like Balaam, that if you do these things, you will disobey God, you will not worship God, and it will be your destruction. So he says, you have the ones who are doing the teaching of Balaam, and then you have the Nicolaitans, who obviously were it came out the same, even though the Nicolaitans are, from the best we can guess or see, were kind of philosophy oriented. You have maybe temptation from 2 sides. From the worldly people who say, we do this and it's fun and it's no harm, so why are you not having a good time like we are? And then you have the ones who say, no, philosophically, you have to accept that this is the way we ought to live, not the way you think. And so, but it all comes out the same. And Jesus has the same command for both. Repent, therefore, otherwise I will come and fight with you. Now, when you look at what he says as an introduction to these churches, each time he's talking about who he is, but who he is has a different emphasis. So to Smyrna he says that he is the first and the last. They seem to have this idea that because they were a city that was destroyed and rebuilt and now was so admired by the whole world that they had it made, they were sitting pretty. And by Jesus saying, I'm the first and the last, he's saying, before you ever were a city, I was the one who set what was right and wrong, and I will be there at the last. The way we sometimes use the term, the bottom line is. So he's saying to them, don't feel like your history and your pride as the city is your protection against God, then who died and came to life again. Just the idea that the resurrection seals his authority and his power and his deity and his eternity. So then when in Pergamum he says, the one with the sharp double-edged sword, okay, that would speak of the ability to punish, to use the sword, and yet the sword that he speaks of is the sword of his mouth. And he says, I will soon come and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth, in verse 16. So he says, I don't need to have physical weapons and kill people. I have the weapon of my authority, my voice, and I will speak your condemnation, and that will take care of it. So the double-edged sword is kind of showing I'm one who has power to do something. and the power is in my very word, in my very authority. Now, Thyatira, we don't know much about Thyatira. Interestingly, there's one group who says, well, all we know about Thyatira is that Lydia, the woman that was converted, she already was a believer in the true God, but she didn't know Jesus. She didn't know the real story. So Paul told her the real story, and she became a true believer in the beginning of the Philippian church. So she invited them to meet in her home. And she was a businesswoman who sold purple cloth. And the purple cloth came from her hometown, Thyatira. So, but other than that, we really don't know a lot about the city of Thyatira. But he says, these are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like blazing fire. What does that mean? That means that I see what's going on, and I have the ability to combat it. The blazing eyes show that he searches with power, and then the burnished feet like bronze. If you go back and read the 10th chapter, I think, is of Daniel, he sees this angelic figure who has the blazing eyes and has the whole body made of bronze. The bronze is power, it's strength. That's why they made the bronze. It was stronger than anything that they'd had before. So saying that this is the one who has the blazing fire eyes and the burnished bronze feet, says this is a person that can judge you and will judge you. I know your deeds, your love and faith, your service and perseverance. Very much the same things he says to Ephesus. I know your deeds. Now when he talks about works and things that he likes, we think about Matthew's parable of the great judgment, where Jesus says, separates the sheep from the goats, and he says to the sheep, I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and in prison and you came and visited me. We kind of get some idea of the works and how these churches in their pagan cities were accomplishing these works and deeds that he commends. But when he says love and faith, service and perseverance, he's kind of putting these things together. You loved me enough to really stick to your faith, to believe. And we talk about this faith in Paul's writings, that it's somebody who truly believes in Jesus, believes in his deity, believes in the efficacy of his cross, believes in the power of his resurrection. Somebody who truly believes is one of his and is changed by that. So when he talks about your love and faith, he means you really love me and you really stick to your faith. You don't let anybody weaken it. Your service and perseverance, even when it's hard, even when it's tough to do, you still do it. And you are now doing more than you did at first. We're thinking, wow, what a commendation. Unlike Ephesus, who did all these things but had fallen from their first love, in Thyatira he's saying, you've gotten better, you've improved, you're doing more of the things that please me than you did at first. But nevertheless, I have this against you. Now, this is interesting, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel. Who is this Jezebel? Well, like Balaam, Jezebel is a character from the Old Testament, and we have to understand what he's saying here in terms of, I don't think that this is a woman whose physical name was Jezebel, or it may not even have been one particular person. It may have been a pattern, a belief in people like this. But anyway, she called herself a prophetess. Well, the Jezebel in the Old Testament was the daughter of a neighboring pagan king who's married to Ahab, who's the king of the northern 10 tribes. And when she comes, she brings her religion, and she promotes her religion, feeds and takes care of and creates priests of Baal. Baal was the goddess, or the god of prosperity, of material possessions, and his consort was Ashtaroth, who was the god of sexual activity and so forth. So he says, this is a person who is promoting the kind of things that the ancient Jezebel promoted. But it's interesting that there are some ancient manuscripts now you have to understand that in Greek, there is no separate word for wife or husband. We kind of associate this with the hill people. Say, well, who is that? That's my woman. That's my man. But that's the way the Greek is. Mm-hmm. If you're talking about a wife, it's that woman. So there are those who say we ought to understand that with this text, that when he says that woman Jezebel, and there's some texts that have the word your in it, though my experts say there are not enough of them to pay any attention to, but the possibility that this Jezebel is what the Jezebel of the Old Testament was. She's an insider. Some have said, well, she may be the wife of the bishop, but she's an insider. She's a woman of the church. She's not an outsider who's attacking the church. And as an insider, she misleads my servants into sexual immorality, which sort of includes all kinds of things. I mean, you understand that the physical acts were condemned by the Old Testament prophets, but over and again the Old Testament prophets say Israel is intended to be married to God, and any time that they have goings on, worship kind of things with demons, with idols, it's like adultery. They call it spiritual adultery. Now here I think it uses the word fornication, which is a broader term. But anyway, you have this same idea that she's saying, and they're saying in Thyatira, this was a city of people who did things, who made dyes and cloth and so forth. And so if you were going to be successful in the city, you had to belong, and if you belonged to the trade union, you had to worship the gods that the trade union worshipped. So she's saying, come on now, we should be in the society, we should go along with this, we should, this is one idea of what this Jezebel means, that she is misleading my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. That's exactly the same thing that was said of the Balaam people to the previous church. So the only difference here is that this seems to be a woman who can call herself a prophetess. Now, we have prophetesses in the Old, and this is just the word prophet in the female, but we have female prophets in the Old Testament. We have female prophets in the New Testament. Anna, who blesses the baby Jesus, is a prophet. Philip, the evangelist, has 4 daughters who prophesy. So she calls herself a prophet. Now, there are those around who call themselves prophets. Some of them are women who have created different kinds of things. But in this case, it seems that this was an insider woman who seemed to be accepted by people as a leader of the church, a prophetess. She calls herself a prophetess. And Jesus says, but she's leading you in the wrong way. I have given her time to repent of her immorality. but she is unwilling. So Jesus says, it isn't that she doesn't know that I condemn these things. She does know. And I've told her she has to change, but she won't change. She's unwilling. So I will cast her on a bed of suffering. I think the text just says on a bed. But what does he mean by casting her on a bed? Well, most likely he means she's going to have an illness that's going to keep her on a bed. But so this translation says a bed of suffering. And I will make those who commit adultery with her. Now this is the stronger term, but it's also the term the Old Testament prophets use for being unfaithful to God. Those who commit adultery with her will suffer intensely. I'm not sure what he plans to do to cause them to suffer intensely. And then he says, unless they repent of her ways, I will strike her children dead. Her children obviously would be those who are really accepting her teaching and living it out and promoting it. And by striking them dead, he probably means as far as their influence are concerned. Then all the churches will know that I am he who searches heart and mind, and I will repay each of you. See, you don't deal with the church as a whole, always. You deal with the individuals within it. I will repay each of you according to your deeds, according to the way you live and what you stand for. Now I say to the rest of you in Thyatira, this is interesting, to you who do not hold to her teaching. She has influence over some of the people, but not all of the people. And to those who do not hold to her teaching and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets. That's an interesting phrase. There's another phrase that talks about the deep secrets of God. And that one we understand. There are deep secrets of God that we learn as we get more deeply into his word and listen to his spirit. But here there are deep secrets of Satan, because it's Satan who's behind all of this, who wants to undo the church. Then I will not impose any other burden on you. I just want you to stay true to your message, true to your beliefs, not be turned aside, not listen to somebody who claims to be leading you but is leading you wrong. Only hold on to what you have until I come. Now, that is another one of these phrases that sort of appears that it's only going to be a little while and then I'm going to come and end all this. And yet we know it's longer than a little while. It's many generations, many years. But as far as they're concerned, if they hold on to the true teaching through their lifetime, then he will come for them in his own way. Then to him who overcomes and does my will to the end. That's interesting. With this word overcomes, we talked about that. It sort of implies somebody who is really aggressive. They have overcome. And yet the way it's used in John's other writings, Jesus says to the disciples, kind of the last thing he says to them before he goes out to Gethsemane, he says, you will, in the world you will suffer persecution, you will suffer tribulation, but be of good cheer because I have overcome the world. And then John says in the 5th chapter of his letter, who is it that overcomes the world? It's those who believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and who live by that belief. So he says to him who overcomes and does my will to the end, who sticks to their faith, I will give authority over the nations. Now this is a little puzzling, but not if you're going back to things that are said in Old Testament prophecy. It's said that the Messiah will have a rod and he will break the earthly powers, like somebody takes a rod, takes something and breaks a jar. He says that he will dash them in pieces like pottery. This is very Old Testament. I will reign over them. He will reign over them with an iron scepter. And it's kind of the idea that those who are the Messiah's people will share in this power that he has to oppose the powers that be. Just as I received authority from my Father, he says, I received authority from my Father to rule and reign, and I give authority to my people to rule and reign. I will also give him the morning star. What is the morning star? Well, Peter mentions the star rising, the star of Bethlehem. It's the idea that stars, God can send a message by a star, and Jesus himself is called the morning star later, so I will give him the morning star. Well, the morning star, just for people's use, was kind of the night is now past and the day has come, and you're all right. So he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Again, each time it's Jesus who writes and says, but he closes with the idea that it is the Spirit who says this, and to the churches, plural. So it seems to me that there are lessons to learn from each of these churches, and we as the church reading them learn lessons and learn what God is honoring and what God is disapproving of through what Jesus says and through what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Okay, so we've covered 4 churches somewhat. Lots more we could say, but we don't have time. So next week we will take the other 3 churches in the 3rd chapter, and we will again compare them with each other and with what we've read today. And we will see what this whole message to the 7 churches is, how it is a beginning point to the rest of the book of Revelation. So if you have questions or ideas, I would welcome them. And I know speaking up in class and explaining things is not what some of you would be comfortable doing. So write me out a question or send a text or whatever way to communicate, and I will try to deal with questions that you have. So let's close in prayer. Have some time of fellowship. That certainly is what the Lord approves and wants us to have, loving each other, and then gathering together to share the word and to share worship of the one that we're reading about here. So Father, we thank you for this word. We thank you for the way in which you have expressed your desires and given us an opportunity to understand what not only was a problem and the situation in the church at the end of the 1st century, but is a situation in the church of every century. So help us to see ourselves and see this clearly, and to be those people that you referred to as the ones who will not give up their faith, but who will hold strongly to their faith and let their faith remake their lives. That's who we want to be, Father, and we thank you for the Spirit's involvement in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.